Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I trust you've been having a really wonderful day so far, enjoying the many great speakers that have been brought together here at another fantastic Canada Strong and Free conference. This conference in particular has a really special place in my heart, as it was 12 years ago that I met my husband at this very conference. And that is a moment that I certainly credit to Preston Manning and also to those really excellent reception suites. So look to your left and right. You never know, who's in the crowd here with you. My name is Christina Iverson, and I'm Director of External Affairs at WestJet. WestJet is proud to be here, supporting this incredible conference where we're connecting people and ideas from across our great country and globe. And this next panel will continue this theme, growing our understanding on challenges facing our cities and how we might together pave the way to a brighter future. Connecting people is truly at the heart of WestJet's service, and we look forward to learning alongside you with today's panel. Thank you, and thank you for flying WestJet. I'll introduce our panel.
All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the fun panel. Today we are talking about issues facing our cities and a conservative response or current lack thereof. My name is Katie Merrifield. I'm the Vice President for British Columbia for Wellington Advocacy, and I am here to moderate our discussion today with our esteemed panelists. So in terms of intros, starting over on the left, we've got Anthony Furey, who is the former Toronto mayoral candidate and Executive Director of the Stronach Foundation. We've got Matthew Spoke, based in Ontario, a tech entrepreneur and real estate expert. Luke Niferato is my new best friend. He is a US-based drug policy expert with the Foundation for Drug Policy Solutions. And then my good friend Aaron Gunn, who is the next Conservative Member of Parliament for North Island, Powell River. Okay, so we have 45 minutes, and so in that time we are going to solve all of the problems facing our cities today, ranging from housing, affordability, crime and disorder, if we can get to it, immigration, and family structures. We're going to start with a general opener on the primary issues that are facing our cities, and then we'll break out into 3 segments, starting with housing and affordability, then into crime, disorder, and drugs, and ending with immigration and family structures. All of the candidates are welcome to candidates. This is a debate. Yeah. All of the panelists are welcome to contribute if they wish. And so without further ado, let's go. Also, if you disagree with each other, feel free to light it up. This is the fun panel. So, question 1. So there seems to be a rather pervasive sense of general decline facing our major urban centers across Canada. Housing, affordability, crime and disorder, settling newcomers. A lot of these issues seem to be contributing to a feeling of general malaise, let's call it. So in your view, what are the key issues? What's the major cause of this sense of decline? Why don't we start with Anthony?
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. I've been coming to this conference since really it first started, however many years ago. And I got to say, this year, the energy in the room and the energy at this conference is spectacular, isn't it? It's just great. And I think part of the reason is because people can sense the winds of change that are upon us. And those winds of change are clearly most likely going to come at the federal level, which is fantastic. But one message that I really try to give to as many people as possible is that let's get those winds of change coming to the cities as well, get them coming to the municipal level as well. I think people want that. I think people are ready for it, and we see the pendulum shifting. Because unfortunately right now, people are feeling a bit downtrodden. They're not feeling so great about the state of their cities. We've seen in past decades, we've had the decline of great North American cities. And we're entering a similar cycle right now, cities in America and tragically cities in Canada. But we know if Toronto fails, if Vancouver fails, Calgary fails, then Canada fails. So we can't let that happen. But the good news is that people are getting optimistic about solutions to fix their cities, and those are the center-right solutions that we're talking about right now, to go in a different direction on key policy issues. And I'm really optimistic that people can be inspired by the sort of solutions that we're interested in here. We hear a lack of ideas from a lot of these left-wingers who run the cities. Oh, no, people just have to stay on drugs. We just have to give them more. No, I believe that we can solve that problem. Oh, we can't build roads anymore. We can't fix infrastructure. It's got to take 20 years. We can't do it in a timely fashion. No, we can do a better job managing that. All of these big concerns in our cities, I believe the center-right movement, I know the center-right movement has the toolkit to solve them, and people are ready for that right now. So we need to be optimistic that this swing in politics is an upswing and a positive swing. So I'd really encourage you as activists to bring that to your cities, the sort of change that I'm committed to bringing to Toronto in the next electoral cycle. Thank you.
Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm looking forward. I'm from Toronto. I'm looking forward to a soon-to-be Anthony Furey mayoralty. I think it'll be good for all of us. But I think it's worth stating in a room full of conservatives, particularly movement conservatives that often come from parts of the country that would not necessarily consider themselves urban, maybe with the exception of Calgary, that cities matter. Cities in Canada matter to our economic productivity. They matter to our growth. And even though we don't necessarily win the most seats in most elections in our downtown urban cores, what happens in these urban centers is important to the vitality of our country and to our culture. I think if I were to evaluate sort of what is a functioning city, I think a functioning city is a place where families can live. A functioning city is a place where jobs are created and where economic productivity occurs. And I think that first part on sort of families and cities is probably most near and dear to my heart as a young dad. The issues that would either make a family want to or be able to live in a city, or the issues that would push a family out of a city. And those could be issues like housing affordability, as much as issues like homelessness and crime and safe injection sites near parks and schools and things of that nature. So I think when I look at the issue broadly facing cities, I tend to focus more on housing policy, the area that I work in, but really anything that would make it more viable for a family to be formed in a city, for people to want to migrate towards cities, and as a movement for us to recognize that the trend towards urbanization has been happening, will continue to happen, and if we cede the cities to our opponents, we will increasingly lose in the future. And so we have to figure out how to solve problems in cities in a way that the electorate sort of agrees with and sees themselves in.
Luke, better up.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. And I think what we're learning is, the cities and the urban cores have had a chance to, they've consolidated a lot of the power in the decision-making politically. Now they're having to reap the harvest of what they've sown. They're seeing what the outcomes are of the policies that they've passed. And you have young families that are in these cities that you're getting at. And I'm also a young dad. I've got 2 little girls, and that drives how I think about the world. You have these families that are growing up in the cities, and yes, they may have progressive viewpoints, but now they're seeing the outcomes of, well, we just said, it's okay to have, cannabis commercial stores next door to our neighborhood. We just said it's okay to have an injection site in our city or a string of them. We just said, we don't really care if people are going to use all these hard drugs and all this stuff. And what we're seeing is that the kettle is boiling. And it's not just boiling in Canada's cities. I'm from the United States. We're seeing that all across our urban cores in America as well. A laissez-faire approach to drugs is driving crime and homelessness and all kinds of things that it doesn't matter what your political persuasion is, you don't want that for a future for your society. You don't want that for your family. So we're seeing people flee from these policies. They want real solutions. So guess what? It's a jump ball for whoever wants to be a leader and provide real-world solutions to the communities that are looking for answers to the problem. And so, who wants to step forward and really put forward things that solve these problems and don't make it too political? I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Aaron.
The only thing that I'd like to add, I agree with all these gentlemen to my left here, is that I have a friend from Montreal, and when he came to visit the city that I live in, Campbell River, he called it a village. But the truth is that when I was growing up, a lot of the problems that exist in the big urban centers like Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa back then exist today, except they're much worse. But the biggest change that I've seen growing up in Vancouver Island is those issues of crime, of open-air drug use, of unaffordability, have dissipated out to smaller cities, or villages, as my friend would call them. And we're seeing them in places like Nanaimo, I know here in Ontario, in places like London and Kitchener-Waterloo. Problems that used to be confined to certain areas of big metropolitan cities are now in cities of 30, 40,000 people. I mean, we've seen tent cities on Vancouver Island in places like Duncan that have 30, 40,000 people in them. So that's a big change. I think that's starting to radiate across Canada. It's going to lead to big political changes, hopefully, in the next election.
Awesome. At the end, I'll be asking all of you how to solve them specifically with 3 top initiatives, but we'll continue to talk about the problems first. So, housing and affordability. Anthony, Toronto, much like my hometown of Vancouver, has a supply and demand problem as it pertains to affordable housing. In your recent mayoral run, you highlighted a number of key initiatives to address this. This is a ballot box issue. What can be done?
There's a lot of bureaucrats whose jobs appear to be to slow things down. And I think one of the great challenges for municipal politicians is how we can really enliven the bureaucracy so that it wants to get things done rather than exists to create work and to create processes. And there are great opportunities there that can be done without necessarily, letting people go. We bring in hiring freezes, we reallocate people, attrition does its thing, and we really incentivize people as well to get results. And we bring in those best practices that, like I would meet with CEOs and business leaders and they'd say, well, surely the City of Toronto is doing this or that, and they'd name these different well-known accounting principles or management principles. It's like not only are they not doing it, they haven't even heard of it. So that's the problem there in terms of introducing those challenges. We need to do that to the planning department. Another big challenge on the housing file is the considerable amount of taxes that government puts onto the price of a new home. All we hear right now is the housing crisis, which we should hear a lot about it, and politicians, they're talking about it nonstop. I don't hear too many of them stepping forward and saying, oh, this tax we've introduced that actually adds $50,000, $80,000, $140,000 to the home, we're going to get rid of this tax. And then they turn around and they say, well, how are we going to do without the revenue? Well, I'm sorry, but the people have told us this is a priority. That means that reducing that tax burden is the priority, and your job is to reallocate those funds. That is the priority, and I know, and Matt knows the metrics better than I do, but in Toronto, sometimes taxes can account for about 30% of the final sticker price on a home. Well, I have a pretty easy idea on how to reduce the price of homes in Toronto by 30%.
Matthew, I do want to talk to you about this issue because you wrote a recent great hub piece outlining your disappointment with the Ontario government, their approach to housing in particular. You were citing some NIMBY instincts. So where did they fall down? And are there any jurisdictions, are there any provinces that are doing this file right?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot to say about our friend in Toronto, Doug Ford. But before I do, I think it's important to connect sort of the dots between these subjects that we're talking about, because I think people watching may say, hey, what's the connection here between drug addiction and homelessness and housing and these sort of broad issues facing cities? I mean, I maybe not shared by my panelists here, but I subscribe to this view of the world that we like to call the housing theory of everything, that at the root of a lot of social ills is this core problem that people don't see a path towards their own personal prosperity. And if they don't see a path towards their own personal prosperity, which historically in Canada has meant if I do what's expected of me, if I go to school, if I get a job, if I save my money, if I get married, if I have kids, I will be able to afford a home. I will be able to have a life that looks similar or better to the lives that my parents had. And if you pull that hope away from a young generation, I think some of the side effects of that is what we're seeing in our streets. It's what we're seeing in our mental health issues, in our drug addiction issues. And so housing is really, really fundamental to this. It's not just about how much it costs you to pay for your mortgage. It's if you take away the hope, Pierre mentioned this earlier today in his speech, 76% of non-homeowners in Canada today don't think they will ever be able to own a home in their lives. That is a shocking statistic that should be the only priority of every level of government until we fix that number. And out of that will come improvements to all these other social issues that we're talking about today on stage. Now, Mr. Ford, our favorite so-called conservative premier in Ontario, is going in a very opposite direction. I mean, just this week, the Ford government announced their newest and latest housing bill. And what you'll notice in the language that they're choosing is when they talk about the stakeholders of housing policy, they're talking about what they call municipal partners. They're effectively talking about the mayors and the municipal councillors of the various municipalities around the province. Instead of talking about young Ontarians, young Canadians want to be homeowners, they've chosen very deliberately to prioritize the interests of what Pierre would call municipal gatekeepers at the expense of average Canadians that are just trying to find a way to build a prosperous life for themselves and their families. I think this matters incredibly. I think this is what postpones people's decisions to start families, to get married, to have kids. In major cities, you hear often of people waiting until their late 30s to even decide that they want to get married, and then by the time they are married, they realize, oh crap, it's too late for me to have a kid. I've passed my so-called biological window. And these issues are very, very deep issues that are going to impact our society very quickly, because we're going to see an entire generation that has, I don't want to repeat all the points of our panelists this morning who talked about families and child, fertility rates and things like that. But if we don't solve some of these root issues, we're going to be paying the consequences for decades.
Mm-hmm. Moving towards Ontario's much more beautiful cousin, British Columbia. Thank you. This is well-timed, actually. Aaron, is Premier Eby on the right track with his housing plan?
Well, as someone who's currently renting in Campbell River, if he is, I haven't seen it yet. So British Columbia is just as unaffordable as ever. I mean, I know people from the rest of the country visit it and they say, BC, bring cash, because it's true. If you want to be able to afford anything from gas, groceries, or a place to live. I think Anthony hit on it, that the number one cost of any new home in British Columbia, like probably most of the country, isn't labor, isn't land, isn't lumber. It's government, it's bureaucracy. It's going toward paying, it's both the time value of money from the gatekeepers delaying projects to all of the new kind of virtue signaling environmental regulations that may just make it more expensive for developers and construction companies to build the same home that they would have built 20 years ago, or what is essentially the same home. So British Columbia, I think it's going to be a big issue coming up in the next election. It should be a big issue coming up the next election, because I think it's, as was alluded to, if you work hard, if you pay your taxes and you follow the law, you should be able to expect a quality of life that's at least as good as your parents, and you should be able to expect the ability to afford a place to live.
Vote Aaron Gunn. Okay, we're going to stay on Aaron and move to the next topic, which is my favorite, which is crime, drugs, and disorder. So Aaron, you did 2 absolutely incredible bombshell documentaries outlining crime and disorder facing cities across Canada. I'm curious what you learned from your research, and can you also speak specifically to problematic federal policies, let's say?
Yeah, so I think in cities big and small across the country, you see the increase in crime, up 32% since Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister. You see the increase in disorder, in homelessness, in open-air drug use, and kind of general chaos. You see this reflected in polls. More than 60% of Canadians say that believe violent crime is up in the country, and they're right. 40% of people that live in Vancouver report feeling in fear for their personal safety on a daily basis. So something is wrong. I think if you look at these policies of so-called harm reduction over the past 20 years, they haven't so much reduced harm as they've created a whole lot more of it. And I think there is a growing political consensus in Canada that what we've been doing hasn't been working, that things need to change, and people have a right to feel safe in their own neighborhoods and in their own communities. Now, I think as conservatives, it's important to untangle what I found as the 3 threads to this problem and treat them all separately and with the attention that they deserve. So first are the individuals that are suffering from severe mental illness that we see in our downtowns. These are fellow Canadians, and I believe they deserve help. They deserve treatment and a safe environment in which to get better, and I think we owe it to them, and we need to deal with that part of the equation first. The second part is the increases in crime. We've seen legislation from the Trudeau government like C-75 and C-5 that have weakened sentencing, that have made it tougher for police to do their jobs. I interviewed many police officers and talked to more off the record that says they'll arrest somebody, they'll bring them into the precinct. By the time they're finished the paperwork, which might take 5 or 6 hours, they've already been released. And on many occasions, they've arrested the same individual for the same offense twice within a 24-hour period, or even on their same shift. This is not a sustainable way to run public safety in our country. You see in British Columbia guidelines that go out to the prosecutors that ask them to seek alternatives to incarceration or to not prosecute these offenses at all. And to me, it all comes back to an interview that I had with a business owner in London. He had this line that just stuck with me. I tell as many people as I can about it. He said, as a society, you get what you tolerate. Mm-hmm. So if you tolerate shoplifting, if you tolerate repeat violent offenders, if you tolerate this general open-air drug use, this chaos in our streets, that is what you're going to get. And that is what we are getting in Canada. And it's not rocket science. In British Columbia, we have 207 offenders last year who were responsible for more than 11,000 negative interactions with police. This is a small group of people committing the vast majority of chaos, and it's just common sense to keep the people that are causing the chaos behind bars. And the last part of this equation is the addictions crisis that's been sweeping the country. We've created this new class of citizens that's almost zombie-like apocalypse that's swept so many of our downtowns. It's very sad to see what's happening, but we've just seen it exacerbated with this policy of decriminalization. That the only people that seem to be happy about it are NDP politicians and drug dealers, who these days it's hard to tell the difference. So
spicy. See, fun panel.
And a perfect example of how backwards our policy is. If anyone saw Vancouver is Dying, I interviewed a young gentleman. He had this moment of clarity. He was living on the downtown east side for 4 years. He said, it's time to get clean. So he called some number that someone had actually given him, a business card on the street. He went to a government-subsidized or financed detox facility. He got clean after about 20 days in detox, and then he needed a place to stay. So where did the government send him? Well, they sent him to one of these hotels that they had purchased, where literally everybody in the hotel is using drugs. There are drug dealers living in the hotel. He said he got into his room. Within 5 minutes, someone had knocked on the door trying to sell him drugs. He said no. 10 minutes later, someone else knocked on his door offering him to sell drugs, and as well as a free sample. He said no. 10 minutes after that, knocked on the door again. He capitulated, fell back into the old habit, and was back onto the streets within a couple days. I mean, this is the insanity of the policies that we're pursuing. Now we're obviously seeing the government doing exactly what the pharmaceutical companies did in the first place, which handing out this so-called safe supply, hydromorphone, a deadly opioid that they're marketing as safe, just like Purdue Pharmaceuticals did with OxyContin. We're doing the exact same thing, making the same mistakes. Instead of handing out free drugs, we need to get these people into treatment, we need to get these people into recovery, and we need to return them to being productive, tax-paying members of society.
Absolutely.
Once again.
Well said. Luke, I am dying to pick your brain on this. You are a U.S. Drug policy expert. You fought against the legalization of cannabis. And so I'm curious from your perspective, with the pursuit of initiatives like decriminalization and safe supply here in Canada, like what can communities expect?
Yeah, great question. And Aaron, just fantastic remarks. It's really interesting. I like that quote you said about we get what we tolerate. And, not to ruffle feathers around the room here, but, we're in this position where we are tolerating drug dealers in suits today, and they're dealing cannabis, I'm sorry, super high potent, much more addictive than ever cannabis. We have tolerated drug dealing in our society. We're doing that in America, too. And we have set the standard, and now what we've allowed, what we've tolerated is beginning to metastasize. It didn't stop with weed. It didn't just stop with just a little joint. Now we've got psychedelics down the pike. Now we are talking about injection sites in America, and I know you've had them for a while in some of the provinces here in Canada. Now we're talking about a safer supply. So we're repeating the mistakes of the past, and now we're actually beginning to normalize them. And I think that's really concerning. We have to be aware of these policies, where they start and where it leads. And so I think, starting a little bit big picture, then I want to drill into a couple of examples. So right now, I think we're seeing a competition between two different ideologies as it relates to drugs. There's the ideology and the philosophy that, and I think many of us hopefully in this room subscribe to it, that every human life has innate value, and every human being and citizen of our society can live a life free from addiction and free from bondage. Do we all agree with that? So there's that point of view, and then there's this point of view out there, and I would call it extreme harm reduction, that says, you know what, there are just going to be people in our society who are always going to use drugs, they're going to be addicted, whatever the drug is, we need to just reduce the harm of that and basically leave them in their addiction. Or, you know, that person who's addicted to 20 tablets of fentanyl every day, they're just going to wake up one morning 20 years from now and say, you know, this is not good for me, maybe I should get some treatment, and they're going to decide that on their own. Which, just for the record, folks, that doesn't happen, okay? But there is a competing ideological battle right now between people who believe in the innate value of human life and people who think that, you know what, some people we can't help them, we're just gonna need to give them drugs. And, I reject that point of view. I think we as a society are seeing the harms of that in the cities. He talked about a zombie apocalypse. You couldn't put it in a better way. You look at Portland, Oregon. So Oregon, essentially what happened there is it's an extremely liberal, progressive state, completely run by Democrats top to bottom in Oregon. And they said it was in the middle of the COVID pandemic. It was in the middle of all of the Black Lives Matter protests and all of that. Back in 2020, they did a ballot measure. It said treatment over incarceration. And we're going to deal with drug addiction in a new way. No one's going to go to jail. But what it effectively did was it decriminalized the use of all drugs. If you were 14 years old, you could be caught with meth or heroin. You don't even have to pay a fine. It wouldn't even go on your record. They wouldn't even tell your parents about it. Okay, so it was de facto legalized across the state. And what could go wrong? You look at Portland, businesses fled Portland like the plague was happening in the streets. If you go to Portland today, if any of you have been there, you know it is a complete graveyard there now. It is overrun with homelessness. It is overrun with open-air drug use. We had a meeting with the now former mayor of Portland who marched to defund the police, okay? So not exactly a law and order kind of guy. And he said, I want to recriminalize fentanyl. I want to recriminalize these drugs. My staff was walking down the street in Portland and someone blew fentanyl smoke in their face. Okay? So this became the norm in Portland. And so what did we see? Overwhelming numbers of people in Oregon, progressives, moderates, and conservatives wanted to recriminalize drugs statewide. Okay, we were thinking, let's have a moderated approach. We're working with all the people on the ground in Oregon. Let's roll this back, but we can't call it a repeal. People won't like that. We need to say we're fixing it, right? We can't say we're criminalizing it. People won't like that. So we go into the field with a poll for over 1,000 people in Oregon. What was the number one best performing message for that poll? It was recriminalize drugs. Democrats, independents, left, right, didn't matter where you were, they wanted to recriminalize drugs because they saw the outcomes of the policy decision, and they felt the pain. Families didn't want to be in their cities anymore. Businesses didn't want to be in their cities anymore. So we see the outcomes of the policies that we have decided upon based on this philosophy that I talked about of we are just going to focus on harm reduction and make people as comfortable as we can while they're addicted. We can't do that. It's not good for society, it's not good for the economy, and it's not good for our families. So we need to return to this philosophy that every life has value. What does that look like? From a policy perspective, it looks like creating a culture of recovery and a climate of prevention. We can prevent drug use before it starts, folks. We can't just toss the towel in. Certainly, there will be people who choose to use drugs in their lives, but we know from the data in America that if you can keep people from experimenting with drugs before the age of 25, 99% of those people are never going to try drugs again after that time frame. So if you can get to people in their youth, in their young adulthood, in their early adult stages, and you can prevent them from initiating drug use, then you're in great shape. It's a worthwhile investment that saves your country, your city, your locality a lot of money. And that's where the common sense comes in. And I applaud, and I hope you're the future mayor of Toronto, efforts that you initiated saying, let's replace injection sites with treatment centers. Yeah. What a novel idea. Can we please applaud him for this? And that, again, gets at the philosophical dichotomy I was talking about. Treatment and recovery, not enablement and a normalization of drug use. Okay? Treatment And so we're not saying lock everyone up who uses drugs. We're saying let's get them help. Let's get them into recovery. And so when we have common sense politicians, people in office who are going to seek those solutions, I don't think it matters what the politics of the voter are. They're going to say, this person's presenting solutions that are life-giving and are going to make the city a better place to live. Those are the kinds of people that we need in office. The final thing I'll say is, you look at this and you look at crime. And I think particularly in America, and maybe you in Canada get it a little bit better than we do in America, but crime is just not this kind of monolithic thing that's happening over here, and we really should just do something about it and make crime go away. No. There are root causes to crime. And we know that over 90% of the crimes that we're seeing committed in America, drugs have something to do with them. So when we deal with drugs, we deal with crime. We deal with the public nuisance issues. We deal with the homelessness. Vast majority of the people that are homeless on the streets have drug issues. So if we start enacting solutions that start to erode away at this drug problem in our society and our cities, we are going to see the downstream effects and ROI, return on investment, on these other issues that are driving families and communities crazy, like the unlivability of our cities and streets. So,
can I ask a
yes.
really specific question? So, and taking into consideration, I'm looking at Vancouver in particular. So say you have like a street level population, like limited access to recovery capital. They've potentially attempted different treatment modalities and failed. I'm obviously super pro recovery myself. We know that like a 28-day stint in a rehab facility will not address the concerns for this population. What would be the policy prescription? Is it long-term recovery communities? Is it incarceration?
Yeah.
Like, from your perspective, what is that?
Great question. So carrots and sticks are the way to approach this issue. What we learned from Oregon, and I think what we're learning in British Columbia and in Vancouver, is you can't make people comfortable in their addiction. There needs to be a stick aspect to this where law enforcement is engaged with public health to help make recovery possible. So I do think that there needs to be a law enforcement intervention, whatever that looks like, whether it's a night in jail, whether it's some sort of citation, whatever it might be, to help make folks who are living on the streets, who are in active addiction, it's not comfortable for them to stay that way. There are consequences. If you are going to be homeless in a community of families and you're going to be smoking fentanyl and blowing the smoke in people's faces and whatever else, that's not going to be tolerated by our society. But you know what? You have a choice if you're that person. You can choose that night or a term in jail, or you can go to treatment. We need to make treatment available on demand to everyone who needs it. What we know from addiction is that the moment that person arrives at the conclusion, I need help, they need to be able to get help right away. Otherwise, their addiction is a disease. It will take them over. It will drive them to do things they don't want to do. We know that. We have to get to them right away. So treatment needs to be available on demand. We have to have law enforcement back at the table, back involved with public health. No, I'm not calling for criminalizing everybody and instituting a war on drugs like what we have in America, but we have to have law enforcement at the table. It just doesn't work any other way. The other piece of this is that we have to understand addiction is not a linear process. Solving addiction and getting people into recovery, it's not linear. Some people, a good friend of mine from San Francisco, some of you may have heard of him, Tom Wolfe, he's in recovery from fentanyl and opioid addiction. And he spent 6 months in jail, and that's what he needed to get clean. And so he says, that is a path to recovery. But other people say, I didn't need to go to jail. I needed my loved one to say, you know what? We're going to divorce if you don't get this solved. Or I needed to, face my kids that after that week-long stint in addiction when I was out on the streets, and that was enough to get me to go into recovery. So I think understanding that there are many paths to recovery, having a compassionate approach to folks, but with firmness, because we cannot accept the downstream effects of drug use. We have to acknowledge that piece of it as a society as well.
Yeah, fair, firm, and compassionate. Shout out to the Alberta model.
And one other thing I'll say about Vancouver, so Alberta's got a great model going on, and I think we need to see that extended to all the communities in Canada. We can't just have, one or two provinces where they're getting this right, and then we're leaving the other cities and the other provinces to rot. We just can't do that. But we are actually starting an organization called Prosper here in Canada. You can go to prosperca.org, and I want to shout out Kevin Sabet, who I work with to run the organization. He's former Bush, White House, Obama White House senior policy advisor. He now lives in Vancouver. He's doing the work on ground zero while running our multiple organizations and doing this together across the country of the United States and now Canada. We're trying to bring these real solutions I'm talking about today to the ground in Vancouver, working with the Aarons of the world, working with hopefully the future mayors of Toronto of the world to bring these solutions here in Canada as well, because I think there's a lot to learn from America, and we're seeing it there on the ground.
Epic. Okay, so as I said, this is going to be a comprehensive discussion. So now we're going to go to the less sensitive topics of marriage and immigration. So, Matthew, on a recent Hub podcast, there were scholars from leading educational institutions. They argued that marriage and two-parent families, rather than love and money, provide the necessary foundation for successful kids and societies. Can you speak to this?
Yeah, and you know, without jumping too abruptly over to a completely unrelated subject, I do want to try to tie this into what Luke was just talking about. I think part of, you know, I'm not an expert in drug policy or treatment by any stretch, but I always question, what is it that gets that person to that point in their life where they make that first decision, or what are the options available to somebody coming out of recovery when they stumble into an economy that is just not designed for them, an economy that is unachievable. You go through a 28-day treatment and you come out the other end and your paycheck doesn't pay for rent, or you can't afford groceries. And what are the likelihoods that if we don't solve this sort of deeper rooted issue, that you're just going to have people sort of turning back to the lifestyles that they're trying to get treatment out of? I think marriage is a huge part of that. I mean, I mentioned this in my opening remarks around the importance of families and the importance of designing cities so that family is an achievable aspiration. I think marriage is a step towards family formation, and without this ability to sort of see that for yourself, to see that, you know, within the very realistic path of my life, I'm going to find somebody that is willing to marry me, we're going to have children together, and we're going to create a stable environment for our kids, I start to lose hope as a young person. I mean, I think I'm fortunate. I'm married. I have two beautiful children. But there's a lot of people in my generation that are still seeking that. And life just sort of seems like it starts to look like it's without purpose. And if life looks like it's without purpose, you look elsewhere for purpose or for fulfillment, right? And that can often take you down some dark paths. So, I mean, I do think that core to all this is giving young people a path towards marriage and family formation. I think a lot of that is rooted in affordability. I mean, I think part of that sort of translates into the culture that we've created in our cities. But all of that sort of leads to better outcomes in all of these topics that we're talking about. Kids coming out of married households are a lot less likely to make the decisions that we're sort of pointing to here today. The statistics are very, very strong in favor of kids being raised in households with two present and active parents in their lives, let alone the parents themselves or the people who want to become parents having a view towards the possibility of a stable future and a stable life for themselves. So I don't think these things are unrelated subjects at all. I think you'll find a lot of young people that did not see hope for their own lives that end up on the streets. And I think some of that hope, if you poll the average person, I know this morning's panel was talking a lot about women and their desire for children, but I think equally if you poll men and you ask them the desires for their own lives, you'll find the vast majority of males want to get married. They want to have a family. They want to see a path towards stability. And I speak about men just because in this context, men are disproportionately impacted by addiction, homelessness, and all of the sort of negative side effects getting pulled into sort of the criminal world. So I think this is a fundamental issue. I worry that if we only look at this from the perspective of solving the addiction and crime problem, we miss sort of the causes of what gets people to these points in their lives where they're making these decisions. And we also miss what happens after. What happens after they come out of treatment, and what does their life look like? Because often it's easier to sort of numb the fact that your life is just not on the path you wanted it to be versus, you know, actually giving a hopeful path back to these people so they can actually see themselves, you know, 20 years down the road in a better place.
Audience participation time. Raise your hand if you're married. Raise your hand if you're happy. Oh, that was a test.
Tricky.
Everybody passed. We're going to have to kick immigration off this topic today because we've canvassed so much here, and I want to hear the top 3 things from each of our panelists today. What needs to be rectified immediately to build safer, healthier, thriving communities? Let's start with Aaron.
Number one, I think we need affordable housing in this country, so we need to make sure we're quite simply supply is equaling demand, and we're not bringing more people into the country than we are building houses, so those need to be in alignment. Number two, obviously I'm a big fan of axing the carbon tax to stop with the environmental virtue signaling that's making gas, groceries, and home heating more expensive. And then number 3, when it comes to safer communities, scrap the soft on crime, catch and release justice system, repeal bills like C-75 and C-5 that have been passed by the Trudeau government, appoint judges who put taxpayers and law-abiding citizens first, and yeah, we can clap for that. And follow the lead of Oregon and reverse the disastrous decriminalization experiment that's been happening in BC. And finally, for the love of God, stop trying to treat an addictions crisis by handing out more drugs that caused the addiction crisis in the first place, and get back to doing what they're doing in Alberta, building treatment centers, getting people into recovery, and doing that by funding it using the money that we get from suing the pharmaceutical companies that helped cause this problem in the first place.
There you go. Luke.
Good stuff there, Aaron. I mean, I think the number one thing is to bring a climate of recovery to our cities. So orient services, funding, and our healthcare mechanisms that we're doing to treat this addiction crisis towards the ultimate goal of getting people into sobriety and getting people into recovery. That's critical. Number 2, I think we need to call out the corporate conglomerates that are trying to profit off of, let's be real, drug dealing. We cannot normalize that in our society. We cannot normalize pushing drugs on our communities, those most vulnerable. I could go on and on about the communities that are targeted. I think we all know who are. Those communities have to be elevated so they can have a chance about what you're talking about. Having a family, having a home, those are things that are very important. And then the final thing I'll say is we really need to make sure that people have access to treatment in this country as well as in my own. I think treatment is really critical so that people can get help when they need it.
Matthew.
I'm simple. I'm a single-issue voter. I mean, I said this earlier. I deeply, deeply believe in what I like to call the housing theory of everything. I think if we solve this one issue, I think we will see significant improvements in all of the sort of secondary issues that flow out of this. I don't disagree with anything that Aaron and Luke have sort of proposed, but I'll stick to my lane and say let's focus on building homes so that young people can see a path to a prosperous life.
Mm-hmm.
I think the top thing that we need to do is address the public safety confidence crisis we have in our cities, where people don't feel confident in their communities anymore. Defund the police is an abject failure that's been harming low-income people, people of various different immigrant communities, hardworking, low-income communities are harmed most by defund the police, and that hasn't just been happening the past couple of years, but the past decade. We've been defunding the police. We need to reverse that. In Toronto, you call 911, no guarantee anyone's going to respond, and that's not to knock the officers. They would be there if they had the resources. Number 2, we didn't have a chance to talk about the infrastructure issue. We need to get our cities moving. How can we grow the pot, to share the spoils, to let young people have good jobs and purchase homes if we can't move goods around, if we can't get to work? So we need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to stop replacing vehicular lanes with bike lanes. It's just destroying the ability. That's always the biggest applause lane, the bike lane issue. I can tell you, anyone running for office, do the bike lane issue. It's a very popular one, and it is a very genuine one. It's really causing challenges. And the third one, the affordability crisis is real, and yet municipalities, you look at the reports, the things staff are working on, council's working on, they're coming up with many new tax categories to bring in municipal sales taxes. They're all talking about it. We must put an end to that. We must responsibly manage our budgets, and we can do it. Like I said, I'm an optimist. I believe the solutions we're talking about here are the future, and the people are going to want them.
And I might add, just elect Anthony Furey in the next Toronto mayoral election, because I think as goes Toronto, as goes the country, at least from my perspective. So.
Okay, I know that was a lot, but fortunately we solved everything. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and thank you to our very smart panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.